Hello, everybody. Welcome to another edition of the newly rebranded Jacobin Talks. I saw in the last one of the last episodes, Bhaskar Sankara asked people for some ideas in the chat about what we should call this little political education series we've been doing. And apparently, in the chat, you all came up with the highly original title of Jacobin Talks. So we appreciate your input on that front. We do this political education series several times every week, usually Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. And we have some episodes coming up on Friday. We have Will Shockey and Ben Fogel on the end of South African apartheid and the role of socialism in the anti-apartheid struggle. That's at 6 p.m. Eastern. And then also on Saturday, we have our show Weekends with Anna Kasparian and Nando Vila. They'll be joined at 1 p.m. Eastern by Abby Martin. So make sure that you are subscribed to our YouTube channel. Make sure you like this video. Make sure you share it. We're not asking for much. We're just asking for a like and for a share so that we can get this video out in front of as many people as possible, both this video and all of the videos that we've been doing in our channel. And I realized I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Micah Utrecht. I am the deputy editor of Jacobin, and I'm very glad today to be joined by Rob Greene II, who is an assistant professor of history at Claflin University. So he's going to be talking about the life and legacy of W.E.B. Du Bois, one of the towering figures of a whole list of categories of the fight for racial justice in America, of social sciences in America, of socialism, you name it. Really one of the towering figures of American history, period. So as per usual, Rob is going to do a talk for maybe about half an hour or so about W.E.B. Du Bois, and we'll then do a discussion afterwards. And as per usual, please chime in the chat, whether on YouTube or Facebook, to ask Rob questions or comments. And so with that, I will turn it over to Rob. Take it away.
Thanks so much for having me this evening, Micah. And I'm really happy to be joining Jacobin tonight to talk about W.E.B. Du Bois, who's one of my not only favorite historical figures, but one of my heroes, one of my personal and academic heroes. Now, I think the thing I want to start off tonight in terms of talking about Du Bois is really making sure that you understand that I'm going to talk about Du Bois as really three different individuals, so to speak, or rather at three different points in his life. I'm going to talk about him first as a civil rights crusader, secondly, as a radical in the 1930s and 40s, and then finally talk about Du Bois as a socialist at the end of his life. Now, Du Bois, of course, was born in 1868. He died in 1963. He lived to be 95 years old. And really, his life runs the gamut of African-American history from Reconstruction all the way to quite literally the eve of the I Have a Dream speech in 1963. So his life and times were extraordinary. And through Du Bois, we can understand a great deal about not only African-American history and thought, but American thought and American politics and intellectual dogma during that time period. Now, to talk about Du Bois tonight and to do it only in an hour, it really means we're going to have to focus on a few key events in his life. This also means that since we're talking about Du Bois and his legacy as a political and social thinker, we're going to have to really avoid talking much about his fiction writing, talking about much of his other work, even some of his academic work. But I do want you guys to understand that Du Bois himself was an eclectic writer, was a diverse thinker, and was someone who was dedicated and determined to fight for racial justice for everyone. Now, I want to begin tonight's talk by talking about someone else that Du Bois is well aware of. In 1899, as Du Bois was beginning his work at Atlanta University in Georgia, a man by the name of Sam Hose was actually captured by a mob in Georgia and later lynched. Now, Hose had been accused of murdering a white man. Now, Hose said that he did it in self-defense, but people believed that not only he killed that man, but then he also went on to rape a white woman as well. Hose was captured and lynched. Now, the thing about the Sam Hose lynching that I think is really important and is really important to Du Bois's story is that when Sam Hose was lynched, not only was he lynched, he was also burned alive. He was burned for close to 30 minutes. His body was torn apart, and parts of his body were put on display in stores all across Atlanta. Now, what does that do with Du Bois? Well, the day of the lynching, Du Bois was actually walking to an office in Atlanta, the office of the Atlanta Constitution, newspaper under the leadership at the time of Joel Chandler. And Du Bois was actually walking to Chandler's office to present to him evidence saying that Hose shouldn't be lynched. He should be given a fair trial. We should allow the judicial system to do its due diligence in deciding if he was guilty or not of murder and of sexual assault. Now, on his way to Chandler's office, Du Bois walked by a storefront. And in the storefront, he looked to the side and he realized what he was looking at was actually the burnt, charred remains of Sam Hose's knuckles. Now, at that point, Du Bois turned around, he walked back to his home, and he did not even try to go to Chandler's office because at that point, Du Bois realized there was a lot more he had to do than to talk to respectable white Southerners about the race issue. Now, many decades later, Du Bois would write in his autobiography, which was released posthumously in 1968, that the Sam Hose lynching had a pivotal effect on his life. I'm going to read you a very brief section from his autobiography. It was actually published posthumously thanks to the efforts of Herbert Aptheker and others. But in his autobiography written in the 60s, Du Bois wrote this. After breaking off his meeting with Joel Chandler Harris, he said, quote, "Two considerations thereafter broke in upon my work and eventually disrupted it. First, one could not be a calm, cool, and detached scientist while Negroes were lynched, murdered, and starved. And secondly, there was no such definite demand for scientific work of the sort that I was doing, as I confidently assumed would be easily forthcoming." End quote. In other words, when Du Bois went off to Harvard in the 1890s, when he later went to the University of Berlin during that same decade, when he achieved heights that most Americans, white and black, could not even dream of in academia, Du Bois assumed that that would be his ticket to helping out his race to achieve greater things for themselves and for others. Instead, the Sam Hose case helped to further galvanize Du Bois into being not just a scholar, but a scholar activist, and at some points in his life, more of an activist scholar. Eventually, of course, Du Bois would help found organizations such as the Niagara Movement, which would be the precursor to the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Now, in the first decade of the 20th century, Du Bois and other Black intellectuals are really grappling with this idea of the Negro problem, or rather the so-called Negro problem. In essence, trying to figure out, nearly 50 years after emancipation, what was left to be done to make sure that white and Black Americans were actually on an equal and level playing field in the United States of America. Now, Du Bois, throughout his entire adult life, would offer a wide number of ideas on how to handle this. And at the beginning of his illustrious public career, he would write about such things as the idea of the talented 10 in the Souls of Black Folk, released in 1903, where Du Bois would make an argument that the top 10% of Black America could really lead the rest of the race to greater heights, could show essentially they were worthy of equality, worthy of freedom in the eyes of white Americans. Now, it is worth noting, by the way, that Du Bois would later go on to change his mind about the talented 10th idea. And I think one of the greatest lessons we could all learn from Du Bois is the fact that he was willing to change his mind publicly during the course of his life. The talented 10th idea to him made sense in 1903. It made much less sense by the 1940s. The thing about Du Bois as civil rights champion, though, in the early 20th century, is that he is also exploring how to fight for freedom and democracy through activism, through scholarship, through his writing, whatever avenue he can use. And what makes Du Bois interesting is not only the fact that he becomes really the chief spokesperson for African Americans, or one of several, battling, of course, with Booker T. Washington during this time period, fighting over the idea of the value of a classical liberal arts education for himself versus the ideas being put forward by Booker T. Washington of a more industrial education. Not only is Du Bois important there, but he's also in correspondence with people all over the world about the question of freedom and social justice. He has a correspondence with Max Weber of Germany, for example, in the early 20th century, where they're exchanging ideas about the realm of sociology and how sociology can say more about both the United States and Germany. Du Bois is also in constant contact with other white and Black leaders of the civil rights movement at home in America. And he's also, of course, in contact with other Black leaders across the Black diaspora in Europe and Africa as well. And I think what's really important about Du Bois is that even though he is a champion of civil rights in the early 20th century, he never divorces that idea from a broader call for international solidarity. So in the 19-teens and 1920s, Du Bois is also talking extensively about the need to make sure that as Black Americans are freed, that their brothers and sisters in Africa and elsewhere are free as well. And so Du Bois attends the first few rounds of Pan-African conferences in 1900 in London, in 1919 in Paris, 1921 all across Europe, so on and so forth. And as you can see it from the picture, Du Bois is here with other intellectuals and politicians across the Black diaspora, Black leaders from the Caribbean, from South America, from Europe and their colonial possessions, and Africa. Now, with all of that said, and again, I think we cannot downplay the importance of Pan-Africanism to Du Bois's thought, this idea of international solidarity. Du Bois, at the same time, had early in his career a certain idea of political organizing that was what we now very much call a top-down idea. And certainly when the NAACP was initially formed, it was seen as an organization of primarily well-to-do middle-class whites working side by side with well-to-do and middle-class Black Americans. This organization ran the serious trouble in the 1920s, competing for support from Black Americans, going up against Marcus Garvey and his Universal Negro Improvement Association in the 1920s. Again, Du Bois was really focused more on the intellectual underpinnings of activism and organizing, but Garvey was much more adept at being able to pull together large mass gatherings and to really appeal to Black Americans all across the United States and to put in the language of an African diaspora this idea that you were part of something greater than yourself that Du Bois at times struggled to achieve. Now, the thing is that I really want to point out that throughout the 20th century, Black leaders in America and elsewhere would often argue and compete over what idea was the best idea that could lead to Black liberation. And by the 1920s, Du Bois had already had run-ins with Booker T. Washington over how best to achieve freedom, later on with Marcus Garvey over how best to achieve freedom in the 1920s. What is worth noting, again, I just want to point this out, is that Du Bois was able to live long enough to think about those earlier battles with Washington and Garvey and to say, at the very least, I could draw some ideas from them that I would later use himself. I'll give you a quick example of this. In 1961, shortly before Du Bois would leave for Ghana, which we'll get to in just a moment, he gave an interview to the Atlantic Monthly where he told the interviewer that he actually felt that Booker T. Washington wasn't entirely wrong. He felt that Washington wrongly emphasized industrial education, but Du Bois pointed out we were both fighting for scarce resources when it came to the funding and supporting of Black colleges and universities across the country. Now, in the early 1900s, 19-teens, 1920s, and before the Great Depression, Du Bois and the NAACP, they're still very much trying to figure out how best to fight for civil rights in the country that is still very much dedicated to white supremacy and is perfectly fine with allowing Jim Crow segregation to run amok in the American South and to have forms of it all across the country. Now, by the 20s, of course, you have the beginnings of the Great Migration, where you have thousands and then eventually millions of African Americans leaving the South and moving north for a variety of reasons, for opportunities and industrial jobs, for greater freedoms in the North, loss of jobs in the South because the agricultural economy of the South was changing rapidly too. But also in the North, with the growing population of Black Americans, you have a growing strength of Black voters too, which Du Bois noticed as well. In 1928, Du Bois writes an essay in the Crisis magazine, which he was the editor of for the NAACP for many years, titled The Negro Voter. And in that essay, Du Bois sketches out this idea that if there are sufficient numbers of Black voters in places like New York and Philadelphia, Chicago and Detroit, then they could play a pivotal role in local and state and eventually national elections. Now, this idea was in some ways ahead of its time, because while Black voting strength in the North was growing, the issue that Du Bois and other leaders pointed out was that if you were Black in the 1920s, when it came to presidential elections, it was really slim pickings. You had a choice between the Republican Party, which prided itself on being the party of Lincoln, but really hadn't supported Black civil rights extensively in decades, versus a Democratic Party, which was in the South, a rapidly white supremacist party. And the North was struggling to adjust to fighting for Black votes. Nonetheless, Du Bois pointed out that in the future, this Black political strength could become incredibly important. Now, while Du Bois would spend his entire life fighting for civil rights and for freedom, by the 1930s and the Great Depression era, he would enter what I like to call a more radical phase of his career. He was not just focused on civil rights, but he was also beginning to think harder and more in depth about how you link together the issues of economics and race in American society. Of course, this line of thinking was exacerbated greatly by the Great Depression, which opened up a number of fissures in American society that were already lingering there in the 19 teens and 20s, but exploded into full view by the 1930s. Now, during the 30s, Du Bois was starting to really reevaluate his own liberalism. He was starting to think, well, I can't be so sure that fighting for civil rights will be enough. We'll have to look at a more holistic engagement with American society. It also includes economics, also includes class. And this would lead Du Bois by the 1930s to begin to push Black Americans to support more self-help, cooperative economic programs. Now, to many observers, it sounded as though Du Bois was simply parroting what Garvey was saying just a decade earlier. Basically, self-help for Black Americans, opening up your own shops and stores. And Du Bois admitted, yes, some of these ideas were like Garvey's, but the important thing here was that the Great Depression had taught him and many others that the American economy was incredibly fragile. And that fragility was 10 times worse for Black Americans. If you looked all across the South, for example, and really across the country, Black unemployment rates were far worse than white unemployment rates. There were cities like Atlanta where unemployment was as high as 1 out of every 2 African Americans might be able to find work at the height of the Great Depression. You add to this the fact that Du Bois, being someone who was well-traveled and well-learned about the rest of the world, was able to observe the rise of fascism all over the world as well. He, of course, as I mentioned earlier, was a student at the University of Berlin in the 1890s, and so he looked on with some horror at the rise of Adolf Hitler in Germany. On the other hand, Du Bois was also incredibly intrigued and, dare say, enchanted with the rise of the Empire of Japan in the early 20th century. Now, Du Bois and other Black thinkers, when they thought of cross-racial solidarity, and they thought of solidarity in terms of diasporic politics, they not only thought of people of African descent in Africa and the Caribbean and South America and Europe, they also tied themselves to what they called the Colored Empire of Japan. And so in the 30s, for example, W.B. Du Bois would actually visit Japan, and he would speak to Japanese academics there. And Du Bois often wrote glowingly of Japan's rise as a great power from the early 20th century onward, when Japan defeated Russia in 1905, or when Japan made its presence felt at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919. Du Bois felt it was important for Black Americans to be able to see an empire controlled and maintained by other people of color. Now, of course, by doing this, Du Bois unfortunately downplayed a lot of the terrible and horrific aspects of the Japanese Empire, their conquest of Korea, the conquest of China, their continued aggression in the Asia-Pacific region during the 30s. Du Bois, in his eyes, saw it as little more than trying to defend themselves against European and American aggression. But, of course, it wasn't taking into account the victims on the ground in that part of the world. Nonetheless, I wanted to point this out because, again, Du Bois is really trying to construct this global idea of resistance to white supremacy. And again, this photograph, I think, really hits this, that Du Bois went to Japan in 1936 to learn more from her Japanese counterparts and to really show that they had friends in the United States. By the way, the great historian Joe Horn has written extensively on this Black-Japanese relationship. He just had a book come out recently about it, in fact, where he shows the U.S. government was alarmed by some of the contacts between Black nationalists and other Black radicals on one hand and Japanese government officials on the other. But while Du Bois was exploring this idea of global solidarity abroad, at home he had just put the finishing touches on his perhaps greatest work, his magnum opus, Black Reconstruction in America. Now, this particular book was written by Du Bois essentially as a response to decades of scholarship on the Reconstruction era that made it clear that most white historians felt Reconstruction was a mistake, and B, was proof positive that Black Americans were incapable of democracy and incapable of running and being self-governing. Du Bois decided to take on this challenge head on with his work, Black Reconstruction in America. And the work released in 1935 was not just Du Bois writing about Reconstruction, it was also very much Du Bois writing about the Great Depression. Now, some of the key themes of Black Reconstruction in America include the idea of a general strike by enslaved Africans, this idea that the Civil War was won partially, what was won by the federal armies, partially because of the fact that the enslaved themselves rose up in revolt, whether force of arms in the Union Army or just simply not working, leaving the plantations, having slowdowns on plantations, and so forth. In other words, Du Bois was one of the earliest historians to give slaves or the enslaved agency during and before the Civil War. Secondly, Du Bois in Black Reconstruction in America talks extensively and laments the fact that this was a golden opportunity in U.S. history for real bona fide Black-white solidarity at the working class level. However, that was not achieved during Reconstruction due to the machinations of the Democratic Party, due to the Ku Klux Klan, due to the redemption governments in the South, due to all of these elements conspiring to work against cross-racial solidarity. Du Bois also points out that this was partly the fault of the North, specifically northern capitalists and industrialists who had hoped to make the South essentially into another region for capitalistic industrial economics, regardless of democracy existing in the region or not. Now, at the time it was released, Black Reconstruction America received significant attention from historians and other scholars. Some actually praised it, said it actually gave a voice to Black people in a way never seen in history before. Some people ignored it. What is interesting that I want to know for tonight's talk, however, is that some of his most severe criticism was actually leveled at Du Bois from his left, specifically from Black scholars and sociologists such as Abram Harris or Ralph Bunche, who would later go on, of course, be an integral part of the early years of the United Nations. Both of them were big fans of Du Bois, had respect for Du Bois, but they also felt that Du Bois's use of Marxism in the book was actually, for lack of a better way to term it, showing that Du Bois was actually an amateur when it came to using Marxism in his analysis. Now, we do know, looking at Du Bois's syllabi from Atlanta University in the 1930s, that he had, in fact, had classes on Marxism and communism that he taught to his students, where they read Marx and other socialist thinkers together. And it was during this time, in the 30s, as the Western world is falling all around him, as fascism is on the rise, and as the Soviet Union offers to Du Bois and other radicals an example of what can happen, Du Bois begins to think about Marxism and communism more seriously. And this really takes us to thinking about Du Bois in the last years of his life. Du Bois as a socialist after World War II and up to his death in 1963. And what's important to note is that when Du Bois is working in the 1930s and 40s, he is making friendships and alliances with other socialists, most notably, of course, Paul Robeson, who himself was an acclaimed African-American actor, singer, and by the 30s had become a significant activist on the left. Now, during World War II, what you're seeing throughout the civil rights movement and Black freedom movements more broadly is a greater acceptance of socialists and communists within their ranks. Of course, this goes back to the Scottsboro Boys case in 1931, the Popular Front in the 1930s, the fact that communists were making overtures to African Americans all across the United States and indeed throughout the Western world. And by the 40s, there was a sense amongst many Black radicals that this was their chance to strike a deadly blow against Jim Crow. An example of this was in 1946. In Columbia, South Carolina, there was a Southern Negro Youth Congress held. Now, this organization, some refer to as the original SNCC, to distinguish it from the SNCC of the 1960s, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. The original SNCC was made up of radicals, of socialists, progressives, fellow travelers. Whoever was dedicated to fighting white supremacy was welcome to the organization. And at their convention in 46 in Columbia, South Carolina, Du Bois gave a speech that was entitled Behold the Land, where he made quite clear that he and other activists felt that the South was going to be the chief battleground to fight against fascism at home and abroad. Now, keep in mind, this is after World War II. This is when the Nazis have been defeated and Imperial Japan has been crushed. And yet, Du Bois and other radicals were saying the fight against fascism isn't done. If anything, it's a more difficult fight now because in their eyes, the fight against fascism had transitioned to back home in America. Now, Du Bois told his people in the South, in Columbia, South Carolina, just how important they were. I'm going to read a very brief section from his Behold the Land speech. Quote, "The future of American Negroes is in the South. Here, 327 years ago, they began to enter what is now the United States. Here, they have made their greatest contribution to American culture, and here they have suffered the damnation of slavery, the frustration of Reconstruction, and the lynching of emancipation. I trust then that an organization like yours is going to regard the South as the battleground of a great crusade. Here is the magnificent climate. Here is the fruitful earth under the beauty of the southern sun. And here, if anywhere on earth, is the need of the thinker, the worker, and the dreamer. This is the firing line, not simply for the emancipation of the American Negro, but for the emancipation of the African Negro, the Negroes of the West Indies, for the emancipation of the colored races, and for the emancipation of white slaves of modern capitalistic monopoly," end quote. So Du Bois is obviously making a case that fighting for freedom in Jim Crow South means you're fighting for freedom for everyone. Unfortunately, Du Bois and his friends on the left were really wrapped up and really destroyed by the post-World War II Cold War hysteria, the second Red Scare of the 1940s and 50s. You saw this play out with his participation in a 1948 Progressive Party campaign for Henry Wallace, where he and Paul Robeson supported Wallace in his campaign for president. Certainly, by the late 1940s, even members of the NAACP began to disassociate from Du Bois and Du Bois's more left-wing measures. And also, Du Bois's critiques of the United States and support for the Soviet Union really made him persona non grata amongst American liberals by the early 1950s, so much so that he briefly lost his passport. He had a difficult time really getting his name out there. By the 50s, Du Bois was almost a man without a country. Now, by the late 50s, of course, he'd be able to travel once again. He'd make trips to China and the Soviet Union. He'd meet with leaders all across the communist world. And for Du Bois, what was happening in the Soviet Union and Communist China was a promising harbinger of what could be done if it weren't for the evils of racism and capitalism. By the end of his life, Du Bois had not given up on the idea of freedom, but he believed the United States was not the place where it could be achieved. He had soured on fighting decade after decade, really generation for freedom at home. And by 1961, he decided to spend his final years in Ghana, in West Africa. And here's Du Bois, and actually the photograph you see next to Du Bois on his right is Kwame Nkrumah, the first president of Ghana, a man who was also a college student in the United States at historically Black Lincoln University. Ultimately, by the end of Du Bois's life, he wasn't just talking about freedom at home and freedom for the African diaspora. He was also speaking out against nuclear weapons, against the threat of a third world war. And certainly Du Bois saw his life as a life of struggle against oppression and a struggle for freedom for everyone. Now, I want to end my talk by making a couple of quick comments about what Du Bois means to us today. And I think there are three things we could say about Du Bois in the here and now. One is his importance in terms of talking about international solidarity, looking across the Black diaspora, getting Black Americans to realize they were part of a larger global struggle against oppression. I think we can still learn from that today. Number two, cross-racial coalition building. He was willing to work with liberals, leftists, progressives, etc., from all across the racial spectrum. They were dedicated to justice and freedom, and they were all right with him. And number three, Du Bois practiced what we might call a different kind of identity politics. He expressed pride in being of African descent. He expressed pride in Pan-Africanism. But for him, it was a tool for both activism and organizing on the one hand, and also a tool for intellectual ferment. You look at a lot of Du Bois's works, what he's writing about through his works of history, literature, and sociology is simply treating Black people as though they are human beings. Du Bois understood this was a radical thought for many Americans to grapple with, but he didn't care. He felt it was the right thing to do. And so I think that concludes my comments and my brief talk about Du Bois. And I'm more than happy to entertain questions at this time.
Great. Thank you, Rob. So remember, those who are watching at home, do chime in on the YouTube and Facebook chat with your questions and comments. For Rob, we're already getting some in. Rob Autumn says, nice bookshelf, very compact, not overly showy, and super tidy. So there you go.
That's only because the school year hasn't started yet. We'll see in about 3 or 4 weeks.
So yeah, chime in with your questions, and I'll start off just by asking Rob a couple at first. I mean, when you mentioned that Du Bois's life is so his output is so massive, his activism is so massive that it's truly impossible to fit it all in within a half-hour talk. But I'm just wondering if you could talk first a little bit about what you were getting at the end there about Du Bois and his sort of turn towards the Communist Party and towards socialism and towards communism. It seems like Du Bois he kind of represented a type of scholar that doesn't really exist anymore. As much as the right wing would like us all to believe that academia is this bastion of left wing radicalism, but as you mentioned at the outset, he very central. I forget how you phrased it, but that there could be no like neutral social science at a time when Negroes are being lynched. Like there's no, you can't be neutral in a society like this. And it seems like just the example that he gives of being a kind of scholar activist really doesn't exist anymore, probably in large part because of the McCarthyism that you mentioned at the end there, being successful and not just, really ruining the lives of people like Du Bois, but also, having a real chilling effect in academia. So is that an accurate characterization that he's kind of this figure who no longer exists because of the success of McCarthyism?
I think that's actually a good way to put it. Part of the issue Du Bois faced was that as I had mentioned earlier, he was definitely a scholar activist. He worked within the academy, but he also worked outside of it to fight on behalf of African Americans and people of African descent everywhere. Now, I think the thing that Du Bois really ran into, though, was partly the McCarthyism in the 1940s and 50s, but there was also, for Du Bois, always a friction he had with other members of the NAACP, a friction sometimes had with other members of historically Black universities, a sense of it was his way or the highway in some of his writings and intellectual work. But certainly, the McCarthyism of the 40s and 50s really did some serious damage to his career. At the same time, though, it was during that time period, the 40s and 50s, where Du Bois is writing some of his most interesting critiques of capitalism and of imperialism. He's writing books such as The World in Africa or Color and Democracy, where he's not only talking about African Americans, but he's talking about the ravages of colonialism and fascism abroad and how those things boomerang to Americans back home. Certainly, that wasn't the kind of thing people really wanted to hear, especially during not only the Cold War, but also this triumphalist period in American foreign policy and domestic policy, where we had won World War II, we were the strongest nation on earth. And yes, we had problems with civil rights at home, but we were dealing with those. And Du Bois is saying, well, actually, we're not doing a very good job with either of those things. You add to that the fact that Du Bois was also incredibly outspoken against atomic weapons in the 50s and early 60s. He really sees those weapons as being the culmination of decades of destruction and death all across the world in the name of American democracy, in the name of Western capitalism. And in fact, one thing I want to point out tonight, too, is that Du Bois, throughout most of his adult life, constantly spoke out against American imperialism, going back to the Philippine War of the early 1900s and up to the end of his life in 1963. And to him, atomic weapons in the Cold War was the culmination of years and years of American imperialism and oppression at home and abroad.
Do you think that the kind of activism that the way that he saw his civil rights activism and organizing as being, especially at the end, intimately tied up with questions of socialism and also, with, as you mentioned, questions of internationalism? I mean, it seems like McCarthyism also sort of smashed that example of that was what it meant to be a civil rights activist for Du Bois. It meant being a socialist. It meant being an internationalist. It meant being concerned with what was going on in Africa, especially not about solely cultural questions, right? Or sort of like wrestling with cultural questions of what it meant for Black people to be ripped from their homeland, but being concerned with what the day-to-day goings on of politics in all of the various African countries were. That was smashed, and that then civil rights activists, especially emerging in the 1960s, kind of have to start over after that example of his, as well as of Robeson's. They would probably be the two most important Black civil rights, socialist activists of the mid-century, right? That in the 60s, people have to kind of start over because the Red Scare was so successful in sort of battling them and destroying them as examples of what that kind of civil rights activist could look like.
Yes, and I think that's a really important point that I want to kind of tease out a little bit more here. You do have in the late 40s, especially, this idea of fighting for civil rights being wrapped up with other ideas of fighting for freedom at home and abroad. And you have this idea that some people refer to as the rise of Cold War civil rights. Mary Dudziak and other historians have written about this. Gerald Horne's written about it. Carol Anderson's written about this, and others, about how in the late 40s, there was this moment where many Black activists were thinking both domestically and internationally about fighting for freedom. By the early 1950s, thanks to McCarthyism, that theoretical and activist framework shrunk to where it was much more focused on the domestic side of things and how the anti-colonial movement abroad wasn't talked about as much. The Cold War was certainly not touched. With all that said, of course, Black nationalists were still talking about these links. And of course, by the 60s, you do have democratic socialists and others talking about these links too. And to give you an example of how this kind of thing didn't entirely die out, you do have folks like Martin Luther King Jr. early in his career talking to his parishioners about the greatness of seeing Ghana become free, or talking about the links between America's oppression at home and also India's untouchables abroad. But what you do see is that in the 1940s, there's this moment where the civil rights movement is arguably at its most radical, at least on questions of internationalism and economics. And most of that radicalism is destroyed or really pushed underground to the point where mainstream, more respectable civil rights activists are really only talking about civil rights at home in the early 1950s. That international spirit doesn't entirely die out. It's still on the Black left. It's still very much in the socialist left in America, what's left of it at that point. And it's still also part of Black nationalist movements. But Du Bois symbolizes how, as it was as close to being mainstream as F would be in the late 1940s, and it didn't really get there again. So arguably the late 1960s, with MLK swing towards the left on the one hand and the rise of the Black Panther Party on the other.
And I remember reading in Manning Marable's biography of Du Bois, W.E.B. Du Bois, Black radical Democrat. Martin Luther King was at his funeral, right? And made, or at least gave some comments appreciating Du Bois and his legacy, and not just saying, "Oh, what a great scholar he was, a real example of what a Black intellectual can look like," but saying like, "Yeah, he was a communist, and many brilliant people were communists, and that's not some kind of some kind of contradiction that we have to paper over. This is they're intimately related."
Yes, that was actually King speaking at what would have been Du Bois's 100th birthday party in 1968. That event was in New York City. James Baldwin was also there. And you're right. During that speech, Martin Luther King Jr. talks about Du Bois as an activist, as a historian. And he does have a section in the speech where he says Du Bois was a communist. And King says, well, instead of ignoring that idea or downplaying it, we should think why someone as smart and erudite as Du Bois decided to go that far left. Maybe it's not a mistake he made. Maybe it's an indictment of the system that we live under. And that was really King's way of saying we should be open to different possibilities of economics, of social formation, of social organization than what we're doing right now.
Right. And I guess that would make sense that it wasn't 1963 when he died, but it was 1968, which that time between 63 and 68, obviously King himself had traveled quite a bit of distance intellectually in terms of his own radicalism. And it sounds like he's talking about himself there, right? I mean, we know the radical King that really emerges in the last years of his life and the sort of more open embrace of democratic socialism. And it sounds like through the example of Du Bois, King is wrestling with his own politics. We have a bunch of questions in here. One of them is about the best first book to read by Du Bois, which is a good time to plug what I forgot to plug earlier, which is your piece for Jacobin on Du Bois's Black Reconstruction called The Legacy of Black Reconstruction, which folks can, of course, read on the Jacobin website. I don't know if you wanted to make that recommendation. That might be a little bit thick for the very first book. But, I've got a copy of Black Reconstruction, but it's like, it's staring at me. I'm just kind of like, oh, I'm not ready for the 1,000+ pages or whatever it is.
Yeah, I will tell a very, very quick story about my first encounter with Black Reconstruction. It was as a college student. I was taking an African American history class, and one of our assignments was to write a book review. Our professor gave us a list of books, and I noticed Black Reconstruction, a book I never heard of before from Du Bois, and I said, I'll do that book. And my professor looked at me, and he said, Mr. Greene, are you sure you want to read Black Reconstruction? I said, yeah, sure, definitely. He's like, okay, all right, go ahead. Go to the library to pick it up at the checkout desk, and I had never seen a book that big before. I had, but not very often. But I started reading it, and it was engrossing. Now, with that said, I would agree with you, Micah. It's not the best entry to Du Bois's works. I would actually recommend Souls of Black Folk. However, if you do read Souls of Black Folk, you have to keep in mind that Du Bois is writing this book in 1903. So while some of the language seems a bit dated, a lot of the things he talks about in that book, the idea of double consciousness, the idea of problem 20th century being problem color line, these are themes and ideas that he not only will come back to, but many other activists dealing with race in America will come back to throughout the 20th and into the 21st century. So I would say you should start with Souls of Black Folk. And after that, I would actually recommend, if you can, trying out some of Du Bois's essays. If you look online, you can find some of his essays he wrote for The Crisis and for other publications, or you can find some of his essay collections out there. Du Bois was a prolific writer. He wrote dozens and dozens of books. He wrote hundreds, if not thousands, of essays and editorials. And so I think starting with Souls of Black Folk and working away from there is actually the best way to go about doing it. But certainly Black Reconstruction should be on your list. I'd also add in there Dark Water in 1920. One of the great things about Du Bois's writings is that you can actually see how he is changing as a thinker from Souls of Black Folk to Black Reconstruction to the world in Africa and so on and so forth. But I would start with Souls of Black Folk.
You know, in the Manning Marable biography of Du Bois, which is only 200 pages, a little shorter than Black Reconstruction, at the very end of the chapter, he has at the beginning a quote from a letter that he wrote, that Du Bois wrote in 1952, and said, "I hope you will not either overstress that earlier part of my career or forget that latter part." And then at the beginning of the book, there's a quote from the Wall Street Journal's obit for Du Bois, and it says, quote, "You really have to forget about the last years of Du Bois's life." So that kind of tells you all you need to know, that's where the Wall Street Journal is at. There's a question here about Du Bois's relationship with HBCUs, with historically Black colleges and universities. And that was a really important part of his life, as far as I understand. And it seems like there was also some really interesting conflicts that came out of that you mentioned up at the beginning, like the fight with Booker T. Washington over industrial education versus liberal arts education for Black folks. So can you explain maybe some of that, some about his relationship with HBCUs?
You really cannot fully understand W.E. Du Bois without thinking about his relationship to HBCUs. Without HBCUs, he probably doesn't have an academic career to begin with. Now, keep in mind, when he finished at Harvard in the 1890s, he actually writes in his autobiography that he thought, "I have a Harvard PhD, I can get a job anywhere." And instead, what he quickly realized was that would have been true if he were white. Instead, he's able to work at historically Black colleges like Wilberforce, later on Atlanta University. And Atlanta University especially provides a place for Du Bois to develop his academic acumen, to be able to think deeply about questions plaguing Black Americans. And it also provides him with links to other Black intellectuals and Black academics. And in fact, it's worth noting that throughout Du Bois's life, he was more than happy and willing to speak at HBCUs. He got a degree. His first degree was from Fisk University in 1888. Again, he would go back to work at Wilberforce, where he had some friction there with the faculty there, and really the administration, which was mostly Methodist bishops that he did not entirely trust. And eventually he would land at Atlanta University. Now, the thing is that even within historically Black university culture, Du Bois would find himself as being at the more radical end of the academics and scholars at such institutions. And again, keep in mind, most HBCUs throughout the 19th, 20th centuries, they had to worry about losing funding. They were public universities, or even they were private, losing white philanthropic support or support from white politicians in their states or across the country. And so historically Black institutions had to be incredibly careful of just how much activism and dissent they allowed. You saw this a lot in the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s especially, but you see it throughout the 20th century. And Du Bois, he had a home at Atlanta University for many years. Eventually he is dismissed from the faculty there by the late 1940s. But nonetheless, it's difficult to think of his career existing without his ability to be able to work at these places. And up until he leaves the U.S., in fact, Du Bois is still giving talks at HBCUs all across the South. reaching generations of young Black activists. And also another thing that to think about with Du Bois and HBCUs is that it's primarily HBCUs that the writings of Du Bois, of the Black intellectuals, are often talked and discussed in a holistic, humanistic manner, in a way they aren't being talked about and discussed at most predominantly white institutions across the United States.
But didn't he come into conflict with some of the leadership of HBCUs like Fisk as he made that leftward turn? I mean, when he was kind of on board with the program of elite Blacks as being the kind of vanguard of social change in the United States, then he was, they were happy to have him. But as he makes this shift towards socialism, all of a sudden he's getting into conflicts left and right with various university administrations, as well as also the NAACP leadership and the leadership of every institution he was affiliated with, basically, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, he is certainly having a difficult time keeping that support as it becomes more left-wing and more radical in the 1940s and 50s. Certainly with HBCUs, what's happening is that kind of dissent is difficult to tolerate, again, for the reasons I mentioned earlier. But Du Bois is also running into trouble with, as you mentioned, NAACP and other Black institutions. By the 1950s, in fact, most Black organizations are largely ignoring Du Bois. And if you look at the March on Washington, I mentioned this a moment ago, Du Bois actually passes away a day before Martin Luther King Jr. gives his I Have a Dream speech. Now, I've mentioned this not only because of the serendipity of that situation, but also because before King gives his speech, Roy Wilkins, who was the head of NAACP at that time, gave a short speech telling the crowd that Du Bois had passed away. And in that speech, Wilkins even has a line where he says, although in his later years, Du Bois kind of drifted off the right path, basically alluding to his socialism and such as being a mistake, Wilkins says, on the whole, he did it out for the race. Nonetheless, there was always that tension between HBCUs and Black organizations on the one hand, and Black radicals like Du Bois, like Paul Robeson, like Lorraine Hansberry, like so many others that you saw play out in the 50s and early 60s.
Question from Jessica Forsey. You mentioned the Columbia meeting. Maybe if you could remind people what the Columbia meeting was. You mentioned the Columbia meeting as it being a precursor to SNCC. Could you speak to the influence that Du Bois's works had on the student groups during the civil rights movement?
Oh, okay. So, first off, that Columbia meeting was of the Southern Negro Youth Congress in 1946. And what's interesting is that version of SNCC was actually not well known by the better known SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, because in the 50s, that memory of the SNYC was largely destroyed. Again, this idea of left-wing radicalism in the South is always one that's conveniently forgotten about because memories of it are crushed by the authorities. With that said, though, Du Bois's writings had a measurable impact on generations of activists, Black and white, who were involved in civil rights. I mentioned a moment ago, Souls of Black Folk. If you were a Black person and you were involved in activism, at some point in your life, you read the Souls of Black Folk. Martin Luther King, as you point out, mentioned Black Reconstruction in America in his 1968 address about the life and legacy of W.B. Du Bois. Many civil rights leaders alluded to Du Bois in some way. Malcolm X talked about Du Bois in terms of his Pan-Africanism, just as another example. Bayard Rustin and others looked to Du Bois as someone who really thought deeply about Black America's social condition and social standing. And so the thing is that many young Black activists by the 60s, they had some idea of how important Du Bois was, who he was, and why he left behind such a massive and important legacy.
Question from Nathan Drake. What was Du Bois's relationship to the FDR administration, the Franklin Delano Roosevelt?
That's a good question. And honestly, it wasn't a great relationship. I will say that Du Bois, of course, was heartened by some of the New Deal programs, but he didn't feel they went far enough. You got to keep in mind, the 30s, Du Bois is making his turn towards Marxism, and he's really thinking that, the New Deal liberalism of FDR, it's trying to prop up what he and other radicals saw as a dying system. Now, he was certainly willing to make common cause with folks on the Popular Front. He was certainly more than happy to make allies who happened to be New Deal liberals and so forth. And of course, NAACP was profoundly supportive of this New Deal liberalism. But Du Bois himself was very skeptical. He felt that New Deal liberalism was really, in some ways, a last gasp of capitalism in the United States. And he felt its biggest problem was that while New Deal liberalism had some good things about it, it failed to adequately address racism and Jim Crow in the American South. And until it really took that head on, Du Bois felt it was at best an incomplete remedy for the ills of capitalism in the 1930s and 40s.
You've mentioned, obviously, when we've been talking about how he turned towards Marxism, but what about his relationship with socialist and Marxist groups? It seems, from my limited understanding, that on the one hand, he had a similar experience that some other prominent Black writers and intellectuals, Richard Wright had, where he's sort of involved, and Richard Wright was involved in the Communist Party, but then kind of he becomes disillusioned with it and becomes frustrated with what he perceives as racist treatment by white communists or tokenistic treatment. But on the other hand, obviously, as his life goes on, he actually comes closer towards those organizations rather than going further away from it. So on the one hand, you've got this frustration at racism, at the interpersonal racism that he experiences in these organizations. On the other hand, ironically, he comes to seem to think that they're actually more important to be involved in.
Yes, and I think the thing about Du Bois's relationship to socialism in America, we have to keep in mind it goes way back because Du Bois is writing about Eugene Debs' runs for president in 1912 and going forward. And in fact, Du Bois is intrigued by Debs and his runs for president and his Socialist Party. But again, Du Bois is critical of how the Socialist Party at times sends mixed signals about race. But Du Bois does give them credit for going a step further than either Democrats or Republicans would in terms of forcefully arguing for Black civil rights. Now, the thing is that Du Bois would not actually join the Communist Party of the United States of America until 1961, so right before he left for Ghana. But he was willing to work alongside them from the 30s going forward. Again, as you pointed out, Du Bois himself was skeptical of these organizations because of their somewhat mixed record on race and race relations. But he was deeply impressed by their work with the Scoutsboro Boys. He was impressed by their Popular Front activism. And by the late 1940s, he felt that these groups were important, not just because of their issues and stances on race, but they were also important because they were offering a trenchant critique of capitalism too. And by the late 1940s, Du Bois is arguing you really can't talk about Jim Crow white supremacy without also critiquing capitalism as well. And so for him, those alliances were important because they were tying the dots together in a way that by the late 1940s made perfect sense to Du Bois. And in a way that in Du Bois's earlier parts of his career, 1900s, teens, and 20s, he may not have been as willing to go forth and do so. But it is worth noting that throughout his career, he did write about socialists and socialism, sometimes applauding their efforts to fight against discrimination and against oppression, but at other times chiding them for not doing enough on race. By the 1940s, he's saying that might be the best game in town right now.
Question from Awake and You. Do you find that Du Bois' dissertation is innovative in the fact that he considers the Haitian Revolution important to contributing to the banning of the African slave trade?
Okay, so Du Bois' dissertation is actually all about the rise and fall of the slave trade. It was published in the 1890s, and it's actually still a source historians go back to today to talk about the suppression of the slave trade. And I do think you're right that the fact that Du Bois is one of the earliest historians to treat the Haitian Revolution not only as a serious event, but as being pivotal in the fall of slavery, it does mark Du Bois as being on the cutting edge of a lot of historical works. When we think about Du Bois as a historian, we often think about him writing about Reconstruction in a way that influenced generations of historians, including, of course, Eric Foner and many others. But the way he wrote about the Haitian Revolution was equally important, too, because he's reminding his audience and so forth that actually the Haitian Revolution is the seminal event of the history of the West from the 18th century onward. And using that and utilizing that in terms of talking about the end of the slave trade is also Du Bois's way of saying you can't talk about one without talking about the Haitian Revolution as well. So I think, again, this is yet another example of how Du Bois influences academics even in the 21st century.
We'll almost wrap up here. Just one question from Free Minds. Is it fair to call Du Bois's early concept of talent and 10th elitist, or is that a misrepresentation? Isn't it true that his talented 10th ideas changed significantly in later work like Dusk of Dawn? I think you started to get into that a little bit during your talk.
Sure. Yeah. The thing is, Du Bois, by Dusk of Dawn, which was released in 1940, he is backing away from this idea of a strict talented 10th. And by 1946-47, he's giving public talks where he's saying, we got to scrap the idea of a talented 10th. Instead, we should look to a larger organization of African Americans to lead us to freedom. But with that said, the talented 10th idea, is it elitist? It may be in our eyes in 2020 somewhat elitist, but you have to keep in mind that the worldview of Du Bois in 1903 was one that said we have to lead the masses of Black Americans to freedom somehow. And in his eyes, the best way to do that was a talented 10th. Now, maybe it was somewhat elitist. Maybe it was giving a little bit too much credit to the educated Black elite at the time to be able to lead a movement like that. But Du Bois, as I mentioned at the start of our talk this evening, was more than willing to change his mind over time. I think the greatest lesson any of us can draw from Du Bois is that, yes, he was a man of his time, but he was a man of his time who was willing to critique his time period. And he was willing to change and learn over time, too. So it'd be a mistake to simply say that Du Bois is this man frozen in ember in 1903 or 1919 or 1947. Instead, we think of him as a man who was constantly struggling to learn, to adapt, and to organize over an incredibly lengthy lifetime.
Well, that kind of gets at what my last question for you is going to be, which is, obviously, we've been talking about this enormous scholarly output that he had, and he edited all of these magazines and helped found organizations like the NAACP. Incredible life and life's work. But for those of us in 2020, what are the kind of is that the key takeaway from Du Bois's life? That there is a core to him that was obviously dead set against white supremacy, against racism. That never changed over his life. But basically everything else was willing to shift as the conditions change. He starts with this talented 10th thesis about how social change is going to come about, but then as new kinds of mass politics emerge through the civil rights movement, through the Socialist Party, through communism, through all these different things, through internationalism, Pan-Africanism, he changes too. And so I guess is that the lesson that the top line takeaway that we should take from his life about that ability to be simultaneously like extremely intellectually rigorous, but also nimble and adjusting to the social and political conditions as they change?
I would say so. I would say that when you think about Du Bois's legacy in his life, it's really his ability to tie his bedrock principles to shifting social conditions and a willingness to say, you know what, I can change my mind. That's okay, because problems in American society and in the world mandate that I change how I'm thinking about these particular issues. Ultimately, Du Bois, his greatest strength was as someone who, as you mentioned, was a nimble and dexterous thinker. He was willing to change, not really with the time so much as to change his analysis of what was needed to be done to achieve freedom and to achieve a true radical small d democracy.
Right. I guess you wouldn't say that he changed sort of in order to be in step with the times. If anything, he changed in a way that alienated him from all kinds of people and led the U.S. government to basically declare war on him. Right.
Yeah. The thing is, Du Bois could have played it easy. He could have played it safe. He could have simply said, you know what, I've done my work at age 50. I think there's actually a quote from Du Bois when he was 75. He said, when I reached age of 50, everyone applauded me. Now that I'm 75, people want me to basically shut up. That's kind of a paraphrasing what Du Bois said, but he was exactly right. He could have taken it easy in his later years, but he kept pushing harder and harder and harder, offering a more trenchant, holistic analysis of the problems facing Black Americans and what could be done to solve those problems.
Great. Well, I want to give a very strong thank you to Rob Greene for joining us for this excellent talk and for handling a wide range of questions with great nimbleness and dexterity, much like Du Bois himself. You're able to talk about FDR and the Communist Party and whatever I throw your way and whatever the listeners and people watching throw your way. So we want to thank you to Rob. Rob is a regular contributor to Jacobin. I already mentioned that article about Du Bois on Black Reconstruction, but Rob has written a whole range of articles for us as well as for other publications. Here's another one, that We Are Living in a Red Spring, his most recent article for Jacobin, but he's also written quite a bit for other outlets like The Nation and Dissent, and he has more than enough to keep you busy if you want to go read up on Rob's work. So just once again, this Friday we've got a discussion on South Africa and the end of apartheid and the role of socialism in that struggle with Ben Fogel and Will Shockey. And this Saturday on our weekend show with Anna Kasparian and Nando Vila, we have Abby Martin at 1 p.m. Eastern, and the South Africa show is at 6 p.m. Eastern. So thanks everyone to tuning in. Thanks to Rob for joining us, as well as to our producer Kale, and good night, everybody.
Good night. Thank you once again.